Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento, and this is my lecture for my Inductive Logic Phil 61 course on Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. We're working on chapters 33 and 30 to 34. We're getting to the very end of the book, and we're looking at some of the basic, most central ways in which um, our biases and the construction of our decision-making apparatus distorts those decisions and actually defeats us, thwarts us, doesn't get us what we want. That is, we're trying to make decisions that achieve our goals, and the way we think about these decisions often leads to poor decisions. It often leads to the wrong outcome. It actually defeats our purposes. So we're trying to identify those biases and heuristics and try to control them and improve the quality of the decisions that result. So I had said last time that keeping score in our heads was an example of one of these mental accounting features that defeats our purposes or does the wrong thing to us. And I tried to talk about it in the last lecture, but it more properly fits with this discussion in this chapter. And Kahneman gives this example. He says, look, we think that money is the thing we're after when we're after money, but actually the main motivator of our money seeking is not necessarily economic. It's often emotional. It's self-regard, it's achievement, it's rewards and punishments, it's social incentives, fear of failure, fear of regret, and feelings of responsibility, and so on. That is, that we've got all these emotional drives that are pushing us to get money. The point of money, after all, is that it's a means to an end. It's a means to let you get things you want. But there's these strange emotional nuances or strange distortions that happen because of the way we think about those decisions. So what's happening is that we have a goal of making more money, but our emotional needs are distorting how we make those choices, so we actually don't make as much money as we could have otherwise. So the decision method here is running contrary to the actual goal. So one of his primary examples, and one that they've done, him and Tversky have done a lot of research on, is something he calls mental accounting. Here's what we do. We tend to separate our money and our other resources as well into accounts, like there's different buckets or different containers in our head about this money's for that purpose, for vacation, this money's for groceries, this money's for fun, this money's for bills, as if those are all different accounts. And we separate it physically into different accounts. We also do it mentally in our heads to control its use. Sometimes that works for us. Sometimes it helps. But sometimes it actually hurts, and sometimes it leads us to make mistakes. So let's look at those cases. So we do this. Kahneman says this is a mistake. You put money into a savings account while you're maintaining debt on credit cards, for example. So the savings account is earning no interest, and the debt on the credit card is actually acquiring interest or getting bigger and bigger. So you've got money that's sitting there that could take care of it, and you're actually getting more in debt by not solving it. I take it that that's what Kahneman was getting at. Or you might have this familiar experience where you buy something and maybe it's marked off, or they told you that you saved some money on it, or they said that the MSRP was such and such, and then they took 5,000 off of that and they sold it to you for some lower price. So you think you've saved money. You feel like you've got more money as a result of this choice you made. But actually, you've just got more of your own money. There's less of it that went out. It's not as if that money has now has a different status. It's just yours instead of somebody else's. But then you go spend that extra money because you saved that extra. You know, you look at that receipt and it says, oh, I saved 240 bucks. I'm going to go get that, that set of wireless earbuds that I've been wanting. I'm going to go get that new phone that I've been wanting because I just saved all this money on my groceries. No, that was already your money, and that's just a ploy that they're using on the sale ad or on the receipt to get you to feel good about, you're buying your groceries at their store or you're buying from them. So Kahneman's point is that econs, those cold, rational only math using economic agents, they don't use any mental accounting where they separate money into these separate accounts or into these different buckets. Just all your money is your money. It's all the same. And there's one decision about what should be done with it, right? It should be optimally used no matter which bucket it's in, no matter which account it's in. But humans make lots of bad money decisions because of narrow framing, because they think of that money as being in different accounts. You know, you miss a car payment because of your overdrawing on that account in your head or in your bank, while you've got some money sitting in a vacation account or sitting on your desk or sitting in a can on your dresser because you've designated that to be vacation money, as if that money, if it makes a difference, and that's special money for that purpose, while there's something, a bad thing has happened to you as a result. Okay, so one way that this mental accounting works against us is with sunk cost mistakes. So consider this example. This is one that Kahneman gives. Imagine that you've got a fan who paid, $100 to get a basketball game ticket, and then then they're facing the prospect of going to the game. And then there's another fan who was going to get a ticket, but then on the way, one of his friends gave him one for free, so he didn't spend the money. All right, so now here's the question. There's a huge blizzard that night between them and the game they want to go to. The question is, who's more likely to go out and drive in this really bad blizzard that's very dangerous? Now, everybody looks at that, knows, and you can feel, it feels right that the person who bought the basketball ticket, the fan who bought the ticket, he needs to close the account. He needs to feel like he got something from that money. He needs to feel like that ticket has gotten used. He needs, and the way Kahneman puts it is, he needs to close the account and avoid what will feel like a loss. That first fan, the one who bought the ticket, if he doesn't go to the game, he's going to feel like he lost out on something. He didn't get something he had coming. But the second fan's not going to feel like he lost something if he stays home and doesn't go to the game. But the thing is, the money's already gone, and you're not going to regain it by driving. The first fan is not going to get anything back. In fact, they just put themselves at great risk by going out into the blizzard, for example, or maybe they won't make it. It's wrong to frame that or think of that in your head as a loss, as if it's gone out as a result of you not going to the game. That's a classic example of sunk cost fallacy, which is throwing, the short way to put it is throwing good money after bad. Okay, so here's another example. Investors who are investing in the stock market often think of different company investments, like if they own some Google stock or if they own some Apple stock, they think of those as separate accounts, each one of which they think can only be closed or sold or resolved once it achieves a gain. So what happens is I've got all these little piles of stock from these different companies that are in my portfolio, and I'm looking at them individually as if that's a unit that needs to gain, and I'll sell it when it makes a gain because now I've made some money off of it. And what happens is that thinking of those as discrete chunks of resources, as if they have some special status by themselves, leads people to sell the winners and keep the losers. And they call this the disposition effect, which really doesn't tell us much. But what happens is that when that stock goes up, you feel like, okay, now I can sell it. And you end up holding on to the stocks that are not going up because you're waiting for them to go up. But maybe the right thing to have done was to sell the loser and keep the winner, because the winner might keep going up. But you feel like, oh, I've made my money on the winner, so now I can close it out and I can take my money and withdraw it. And the loser, well, I'm still hoping that I can still get that money out of it, so I'm going to wait for it. I'm going to keep holding on to it, and maybe it'll get better. So investors end up doing the opposite of what they do. They sell high, or they sell low and buy high. As a result of this sort of mental accounting. A rational decision maker is interested only in the future consequences of current investments. So really, all those decisions you made in the past, the money you put into those things, that's gone. And here you are now sitting with some stocks, and they have their value. Or you're sitting with some resources. You're sitting with all the things you have that are the results of past decisions. Letting the way you feel about those past decisions affect what you do now is a weird way of letting something that doesn't exist, the past, reach into the future and change your decision about what's going to happen next. So Kahneman calls that examples of sunk cost. It might be a case where you're throwing good money after bad, where you're not going to regain that investment. So you keep putting into it, or you keep holding on to it, or you keep working at that bad job, or you put more money into something that's just not going to pay off. And the point is, once you've made a decision, it recedes into the past. The only thing that exists, at least from like an econ's perspective, is there's just the new now and the future to think about. All those decisions in the past have vanished. Now, maybe you shouldn't have made some decisions you made, but those are gone. They're over. They're done. Now there's only this moment and the ones in front of you that you can control and change. Now is where you live, and the past decisions shouldn't be reaching into or clinging to or affecting what happens in the future. They're gone. Why are they still affecting what you do next? Feelings we had should not change what's happening now. Those feelings are gone, and that moment's gone. Okay, so that brings us to regret, which is the feeling you have, that sinking feeling, that feeling like I should have known better. I shouldn't have done this thing because now here I am. I'm in this shitty circumstance and things could have and should be different than they are right now. So regret's a very specific kind of sensation. Like I'm sitting here with this outcome and I'm thinking, oh, I should have done something different and I wouldn't be here right now. Okay, that's a weird and distorting, dangerous, biasing emotion that messes up our decisions. See, the thing is, you can't undo the past. It's gone. Having the past alter the future can make things worse and distorts our decisions to be feeling that regret or imagining what that felt like from the past. Okay, so Kahneman says that abnormal or rare events invoke even more regret when one of these weird things happen to you because we can more easily undo the event in our imagination. An example might be, you imagine that there's a plane crash and a bunch of people die in it. Well, there's one guy and you think to yourself, he shouldn't have been on that plane that crashed because he got delayed by another accident. Or, imagine that he showed up at the airport and he missed his plane, and so he gets on the next plane and that plane crashes. Well, that abnormal or rare event makes us feel like, well, he never missed his flights before, so in this one case he did. That shouldn't have happened. Okay, but the point here is that everybody on the plane died. The outcome was the same for everybody, but we tend to treat that one example or this weird, fluke event of somebody who happened to be or happened to not be on the plane as we think of those get exaggerated because they're abnormal or because they're rare. So it affects the norms that we generate in our minds about the problem. We feel worse for this guy than for the rest of the victims, who are all equally victims and whose lives could have led them elsewhere too. But we think about that guy who just got there by chance or some rare event happened and led him into that disaster and think of ourselves, well, that shouldn't have happened. We have this kind of modified version of regret about it. And that can affect the way we make decisions as a result. So look at these two cases. Imagine a guy named Brown who almost never picks up a hitchhiker. Yesterday, he picks up a guy and gives him a ride, and he gets robbed. Now imagine a guy Smith who frequently picks up hitchhikers. Yesterday, he gave a man a ride, and he was also robbed. So the same thing happened to them. So now a couple of questions. Which of these two people has more regret? Does Brown regret what he did more, or does Smith regret more what he did? And most people will say that Brown regrets more, or Brown will feel more regret because what he did was an exception to his rule or an exception to what happened in the past. And we tend to blame Smith more, even though the very same thing happened to both of them. We think that the Smith kind of had it coming and that Brown didn't deserve it. But the same event happened to them. And we have these skewed sensibilities about regret and responsibility and fault in these cases that changes the way we think about what happened, what unfolded. So the lesson here, I think, coming from Kahneman is that the feelings of regret and blame, they produce weird, pointless asymmetries that needlessly distort our decision making. They change the way we feel about Smith and Brown, or the way we might treat them. If you're on a jury and you're trying to assess, damages or trying to assess responsibility or things, these weird emotions we have about norms, about abnormal events, about normal events, affects our sensitivities about, desert and whether or not somebody had something coming. Also, there's a pretty pronounced effect in humans where they seem to they treat these cases different depending on whether they were acting or whether the person was inactive in the events that unfolded. Here's what I mean. People expect, like you expect, to have stronger emotional reactions, both of happiness and regret, as a result of choices that you make actively versus where you just don't act and let something unfold. You feel like you need to act and make it bring about, and that exaggerates your expectations about your emotional reactions more than if you're in a situation where just sitting there and doing nothing will have the same outcome. And what Kahneman says is that default options here in our environment tends to create norms in our head. That is, if your employer has certain default options about the way they do things, then we just get used to that and we resist them changing, or we think that's the way it's supposed to go, like in your paycheck. Um, so that creates a norm in our head versus when we have to act and deviate from the norm, even though the results might be the same or not acting might be better for us economically. And I'll give you an example of a case where default options actually has a good result. So it turns out that if you make organ donation just the default option on a driver's license, for example, the number of people who will do organ donation after they have an accident and die goes way up. And suddenly we have an abundance of organs for people who really need them. But if you make organ donation a matter of having to opt in and act and actively choose it, far fewer people will do it. But if it's the default option, lots of people just go with it. They're just like, no, okay, it's on there. I'll just leave it that way. Oh, it takes action for me to actually remove it from our driver's license. People don't want to do that. So part of Kahneman's point here is that the situation you just get thrust into by the world is the one that you just get used to. And that might be good. It might produce good results, like in the organ donation example, but it might be bad. It might be that the default option that you're being offered by your employer, by your spouse, by your neighbor, or by the circumstances, the default automatic option that just happens might actually be a bad one. It might not be the right one. And just the fact that it's the default shouldn't be enough to lead you to go with it necessarily. It might take you acting to violate it in order to achieve a better result. Or it might be the case that not acting produces a better result, and you should resist the temptation to act because acting makes you feel like you had a stronger role in it. So departure from the default option, whatever it might be, generates regret, and that skews our decisions, but it might actually have been the right thing to do. So the lesson here about action versus inaction is that the asymmetry favors conventional and risk-averse choices. That is, the circumstances or the options that have just been thrust on you by the environment are the ones that you tend to default to, the ones that you tend to accept, and you take those. And it takes courage and it takes action for you to violate those. And fear of regret, you might think, oh, I might regret breaking from the norm here, often keeps you from doing the non-default option, but it might be a better option. There might be some circumstance where the better thing to do was to say, no, that's not for me. No, I don't want that option at all. Whereas we feel like we got to go with whatever's been handed to us. Okay, so responsibility works similarly. Your losses, when they happen, you weigh those about twice as much as comparable gains, especially when the loss is your responsibility or choice. So if you make a decision and that decision is going to produce a gain or produce a loss, and your decision leads to the loss, you tend to inflate that or treat it as a much bigger. You'll recall the prospect theory curve from Kahneman in earlier chapters. Especially if it's your responsibility, you feel the weight of that a lot. Okay, so just knowing that about yourself matters. You will weight it more and it will figure more largely in your decisions if it's the result of your choice. So here's an example of the asymmetry or the difference in responsibility here, and how wildly different people's behaviors or decisions are depending on how the circumstances are framed for them. So imagine you've been exposed to a disease that has a 1 in 1,000 death risk. So this is really bad. It's a really bad disease. Okay, so there's a 1 in 1,000 chance you're going to die. There is a vaccine, but you have to buy it. So how much are you willing to pay for it? Okay, so this is a case where this thing has just happened to you. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your responsibility. This thing's just happened to you. And now you need to go and pay money to get the vaccine. Well, can contrast that with this case. We will offer you the option to be in a study that will give you a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting a disease that will kill you. How much do you want to be in the study? Okay, so now think about those for a second because they're actually equivalent. In the first case, you're now facing a 1 in 1,000 death risk. In the second case, and you can pay some money to get out of it. And in the second case, we're gonna give you some money to put yourself into a 1 in 1,000 death risk. Okay, now people's answers on these are wildly different. They're symmetrical, or they're the same in their results. In both cases, you're avoiding or preventing or getting rid of this 1 in 1,000 death risk, and they ought to be treated the same. But people will just risk it. They'll just take it in the first case and not pay the money, but they refuse to even be in the study in the second case. But actually the results turn out to be the same. So they don't want to pay the money in the first case, and they actually, here's the interesting result. Kahneman says that the difference in how much they will pay is a 50-to-1 ratio. The second feels much worse. They want 50 times as much money to put themselves into the risk in the second case because you did it to yourself with your own choice. It was your responsibility, so we feel worse about it. Like, I opted into the study, so now I want a lot more money for the fact that I'm choosing to do it. Okay, so this is supposed to illustrate the difference between the way action and inaction and responsibility acts on our choices. And I think the point from Kahneman is that we ought to disregard the action versus inaction decision when we're just instead looking at the outcomes. Okay, so there's another principle here that's at work in the back of some people's minds, and Kahneman's got some really critical words for it. The precautionary principle is this idea that, look, if some action increases the risk of a harm, then we just shouldn't do it. So it's very prevalent, he says, in Europe with lots of policy making, that, look, if we're going to do something that's going to increase some risk, it's just not worth it. We shouldn't do it at all, as if we can eliminate risk altogether. This has got to be a mistake because risk is just unavoidable. Some risks are better than others, and some risks are outweighed by the rewards, or our resources might be better spent avoiding other more serious risks. And it especially works with cases about children where people really have this taboo or really reject this idea that we should be willing to, say, pay less for some consumer item that's more risky to children. It's going to result in bad outcomes to children. People feel like, well, there's no amount of money that's worth that. Well, in fact, in all of our lives, there is some amount of money that we're willing to exchange for some elevated risk. You do it all the time. You could spend a lot more money on a car, for example, with much more robust safety features that was much safer, but you're not willing to pay that money to get rid of that risk. So we actually exchange risk for money in lots of circumstances de facto, but when we're asked to do it sort of explicitly, people balk at it. Or the example here I'm using is about vaccines, where the emphasis in somebody's thinking about a vaccine is, oh, well, there's side effects, and I don't want to do something that might produce side effects. That's awful. The Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine has got some side effects. It produces blood clots, somebody says, so I'm not going to do it. Well, look, everything you do has risks involved, and just the fact that it increases the risk of some event by itself doesn't justify avoiding it altogether, because the obvious point here is that the risk of COVID or risk of dying or risk of harm from COVID itself is worse than the risk of blood clots from the vaccine. And I've got some numbers on that in another lecture. Okay, and another phenomena here, and it's a little bit like mental accounting, is that we keep score in our heads. We spend much of our day anticipating or trying to avoid the emotional pains that we inflict on ourselves, says Kahneman. And the solution here is to inoculate yourself in your thinking against regret. So what Kahneman says is, you should be explicit about when you're on the front side of a decision and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'll regret it forever if I don't do this. And you've probably made that sort of claim about some decision. Well, be explicit about the fact that you're anticipating regret. and reflect on what that actual regret will be before. And as a result, you're going to feel less of it after if you really do think about it. And you know that hindsight bias exacerbates the feelings, and you should discount for that effect. So the idea is, well, one of the points, there's several points to make here. And one of them is that Dan Gilbert, who wrote Stumbling on Happiness, a famous Harvard psychologist, has shown us and summarizes the research that people anticipate will anticipate that they will feel more regret than they actually have. And they're bad affective forecasters. They're bad at predicting what will make them feel good and what will make them feel bad. So when you're on the front side of a decision and you're having that feeling like, oh, I will regret this forever if I don't do it, you're probably exaggerating it. You're probably dialing it up too much. And you can control that by realizing, well, we have a sort of psychological immune system that will prevent me from feeling too much about this. And I thought about it beforehand. I factored it into the decision. I made the choice. And even though the bad thing happened, I decided on the front side that it was the right thing to do. So hindsight bias is when you take some information that's only available after the decision and then reevaluate the quality of the decision on the front side. Or hindsight bias, sorry, is more accurately this idea that the outcome should have been more, you think the outcome was more predictable than it actually was. So in hindsight, things are 20/20. In hindsight, you can see all this information about what led to the outcome that you couldn't see on the front side. So you should be kinder or more fair or more realistic to the early you who made the decision. And recognize that when you're feeling this regret later, well, look, I was making the best quality decision I could make on that front side. And then afterwards, actually, you're going to not feel as when you made that decision in the front, you were making a poorer decision than about the pain or the happiness that you were going to feel because you're such a bad affective forecaster. Okay, so another phenomena that Kahneman talks about is reversals, and this has to do with narrow versus broad framing. So imagine these two cases. One, a burglary happens in a guy's regular store, the store he goes to every day, versus his regular store is closed and he goes to a different store than when he usually shops, and a burglary happened in that new store. Okay, so imagine those two different cases, same outcome. He gets shot in both cases. Now, question, you ask a jury about the first case, about the second case. Should his compensation be different in these two cases? So suppose that, a jury is considering the case of whether or not the grocery store or whether or not the company or whether or not somebody owes him something or is liable for the harm that has come to him. And the question should be, should his compensation be different in the two cases? Now, when you look at both of these, when you do what's called a joint evaluation, which is you looking at both of these examples, it's obvious to you that what's important is that he got shot. It doesn't matter where he got shot. That shouldn't make a difference in how much we award him or how much he's compensated or how much fault there was. But what happens in single evaluation, that is if you show people just one of these cases or you show some different people the other case, people will award more to the guy who's shot in his non-regular store. That is, they in effect say his compensation should be different because he was breaking with the norm, he was doing something different, and that produces these different feelings. And Kahneman's point is, look, that's a case of broad framing where when narrow framing, when you look at the single case, you'll say one thing, but when you broad frame it, you reverse your opinion. You decide something different, so you switch it. Okay, so reversals matter because what happens is you're looking at a case up close and not taking the outside view, or not looking at the third person perspective, or not taking joint evaluation, or not using a policy. And as a result of your narrow perspective, you give one answer because of these feelings that are happening to you. And if you were to adopt the broader view, take the joint evaluation, you'd reverse that and have a more sensible, broader answer. Okay, so here's another example. Narrow framing, single evaluation of situations that leads to conclusions that are reversed when we broad frame and invoke a rational principle for the different cases. So here's another case. Imagine that you're comparing different paper towel rolls on the shelf. So you're comparing different groceries that are on sale, and it would be better to do so by their cost per ounce than just the sale price. So I've circled it here. What might happen to you is you look on the shelf and you go, oh, $16.99 down from $22.99. That's great. That's a really great savings. That's a lot of money saved. But what's important here is on the Safeway label, at least, that they've given you a per capita rate. They've shown you that it's 4 cents per sheet. And it might be that some other bag or some other package of paper towels is actually costs more than $16.99, but it's got a better per sheet price. So it might be $20.99, but it's only because of how many paper towels are in there, it's 3 cents per sheet. So doing the per capita or doing the ratio comparison does you better than just the single evaluation where you just saw, oh, that's a cheap price, I'm going to go for that. That seems like good savings. It's not good savings when you look at the bigger examples, you look at the larger context. Same thing happens if you were to say you're shopping for an air conditioning unit and you're comparing the BTUs across different air conditioners. That would allow you to make a kind of apples to apples comparison, whereas you're confounded or overwhelmed by all the little details on the boxes and the packages, and there's all these different facts that are different claims about the different air conditioners that you're not able to sort of easily compare to each other. But if you were just comparing BTUs or BTUs per price, you could get a good, sensible way to compare these two different air conditioners and make them match up instead of having to just singly evaluate them by themselves. So it leads you to make a better decision according to some rational principle. So when you see these cases in isolation, you're more likely to be guided by emotions or make a narrow frame decision that's a bad decision. And what you ought to be doing is adopting the broad principle. Consider other framing, consider similar decisions like it. What's a policy that's rational instead of giving an emotional or narrow answer? Like, okay, so if I'm buying paper towels and what I'm worried about is money, then I want to get the most paper towels per my money. If I'm buying an air conditioning unit and I've got money to spend on it, what matters to me is how many BTUs per my dollar can I get? And that gives me a broad frame policy way to compare these different things that by themselves would be too hard or difficult to evaluate singly. Okay, so last section here is what Kahneman calls frames and reality. And I'll give a couple of simple examples. These are pretty obvious. He's got some much more detailed examples in the text, but I won't go through those. Emotional framing distorts our decision making even when the choices are the same. So, for example, imagine a doctor who is considering these two treatments. Treatment one, the 1 month survival rate is 90%. Treatment number two, there's a 10% mortality rate in the first month. Okay, so which one of these treatments do you want? And if you're like most people and you're like the doctors, you're going to have a preference for one. Doctors choose the treatment much more often when it's framed as one. But the point is that these are the same. A 90% survival rate is the same as a 10% mortality rate, but you've been forced in two to think about 10% of dead people. Mortality is a grim, vivid example. And one frames it in terms of success or survival, and survival sounds better, so we tend towards one. These are the same. So imagine you get two different doctors, or you get a doctor, you get doctors evaluating things one way than the other. You're going to get very different diagnostic outcomes, different treatments. You get the difference between people going into surgery and not going into surgery only because of the difference in wording in the sentences. And here's another really sort of amazing example. It's very hard to get your brain around, but you see it once you do the math on it. So imagine you got these two people. Adam has got a car that's got bad gas mileage. He only gets 12 miles per gallon. And he's going to switch. He's going to buy a car that gets 14 miles per gallon. So he's going to get a better miles per gallon car. Now imagine Beth. She switches from a car that's got 30 miles per gallon to a car that's got 40 miles per gallon. Now that sounds like a huge increase. So assume that they both drive the same amount. Who will save more gas? And to a cursory examination, to the sort of a quick look at it, it seems like obviously Beth is going to save more gas because she's doing 10 miles per gallon better. But when you actually realize that the driving amount is the same, this thing comes out different. You think Beth's the answer, but actually, no, that's not the right answer. Suppose they both drive 10,000 miles. So if you take 10,000 miles and divide it by 14, and divide it by 12, what happens to Adam's consumption is it goes from 833 gallons per year to 714 gallons. So he saves 119 gallons by making that switch. And Beth reduces her consumption from 333 gallons to 250 gallons per year, thus saving 83 gallons. So Beth actually saves less than Adam does. And that's because of the miles per gallon versus gallons per mile comparisons, because of the way we're doing the ratios, because of the way we're doing the denominator on it. And we realize that framing it one way makes one answer seem true, framing it the other way makes another answer seem true. And one of these answers is right. That is, the atom, the answer to the question who will save more gas is that Adam will, but you can't see that because of the way it's framed. So you, as a result of these framing errors and biases, you make the wrong decisions in cases like this. So framing leads us to make decisions according to features of our minds that are different than our goals. And the lesson here is that we ought to be cautious about how problems are framed. Okay, so another really good example of the same thing is some examples I like to give is that shows that framing matters. And it's often framing is being used to manipulate your opinion or your action. So I'll give you some examples. You'll see a bulletin board or a big billboard on the highway that says something like, in the United States, someone is sexually assaulted every 2 minutes. And that's supposed to get you to think about somebody getting sexually assaulted every 2 minutes. Like, that's a lot. That seems like it happens a lot. That's really bad, right? Another one might be every 9.5 minutes somewhere, someone in the US is infected with HIV. Okay, so what's wrong with these? Actually, I'll keep going. I'll show you the other examples. In Sacramento, there are 5 assaults per day. And in East Palo Alto, there's only 0.67 assaults per day. Now, in all of these cases, the way this has been framed, where it's divided over time, 2 minutes, 9.5 minutes per day. In all these cases, the numerator has been divided by time. Okay, time is fixed, but population in these cases is not. So when you use this fixed number, like the number of hours in the day or the number of minutes in the day, or the number of assaults per day, you'll get one result that actually distorts the actual facts. So take my Sacramento and East Palo Alto example. The rate of assaults in Sacramento per 1,000 is 3.88. The rate of assaults in East Palo Alto is 8.5 per 1,000. That is, the assault rate in East Palo Alto, the rate is almost 3 times what it is in Sacramento. But that's not captured by this per day calculation that people are giving us. And what happens is that typically when somebody does this kind of division, where they just give it to you in terms of hours or days and try to make you feel like it's urgent, they're trying to make you feel like a problem is bad. Well, one of the things you want to know is the problem getting better or is it getting worse? Because this might be the result of it's getting better. And the other problem is, what's the denominator here? Because you could have, for example, if you take the population of Canada and you take the number of sexually assault, which is much fewer people in Canada than there are in the United States, and you take the number of sexual assaults per minutes in the day, you're going to get a much lower rate. You're going to get, a sentence like my first sentence that says something like, in Canada, someone is sexually assaulted every 19 minutes or whatever, because there's only, 50 million people in Canada. And because when you divide 50 million versus 330 million over the number of minutes in the day, you're going to get this arbitrary number about time. But that doesn't reflect the real rate, the real seriousness of the problem. It might be that actually the rate or the per capita occurrence of sexual assault, the number of people who are sexually assaulted per 1,000 or per 100,000, it might be worse in Canada and better in the United States. But when you do this weird dividing by time thing, it's not revealed. In fact, it shows it just the opposite. It's like one of those reversals that Kahneman was talking about. Okay, so my bigger lesson here is you ought to be asking The framing here can mislead. You ought to be asking in these cases, what's the denominator? And if it's time, then that doesn't tell me a lot of things I want to know. I want to know, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And I want to know what's the rate per capita. And then that lets me do some comparisons that lets me make a better quality decision. Okay, so let's summarize where we are. We've talked about keeping score and the way mental accounting leads to biased decisions, the way we keep money separate in our heads. We've talked about the sunk cost mistake and this business of don't throw good money after bad. We've talked about the way regret and our fear of regret and inflations of our sensitivities about what's going to happen to us distorts our decisions and affects what we do. It turns out humans have a bias for action versus inaction, and then they have a bias about their responsibility, the extent to which they're responsible for creating some situation. And then we've seen lots of examples about how narrow single framing leads to conclusions that we might reverse or we might choose differently in broad framing examples. And framing very often leads to different decisions that we care about. So we ought to be careful about the way problems are getting framed, and the way that might lead us to make a decision different than what we really want. And that's our discussion of chapters 33 through